I would just add to this, obviously, the work against proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and materials has to be intensified. If, in fact, terrorists finally do get their hands on any of it, then the effects would be absolutely devastating, not just single buildings at a time.
Let me ask Senator Graham, he's the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. How serious of a threat is that, Senator Graham, that the next time around it might not just be airliners filled with gasoline and passengers, but it could be nuclear, biological, or chemical agents?
There's a saying that the generals always fight the last war, and we need to be careful not to be overly obsessed with the hijacking of airplanes as the means of carrying out terrorist offenses. I agree with Senator Lugar that the next may be a chemical or biological weapon inside a suitcase. In answer to your question about what our immediate priorities are, I think first is continuing the efforts to see if there are any survivors in the rubble of New York or the Pentagon. Second, the CIA briefed me earlier today the fact that we are not certain that Tuesday was the only act of terrorism in this plan, that there are still possibilities both outside and inside the United States of further terrorist activities, and so we need to be on a very aggressive level to root out all the information that we can about that and try to interdict any future acts of terrorism. And third, we need to continue the investigation to determine precisely who committed this horrendous assault against America and be able to rally the world community in a united front against these specific terrorists and terrorism in general.
So what you're saying, Senator Graham, based on this intelligence briefing that you had, is that Americans here in the United States and Americans traveling around the world who may be watching this program right now should remain on guard?
Absolutely, and not just Americans. That the part of the plan may have been to be executed outside the United States, aimed at U.S. citizens, but also at citizens of other countries.
Senator Levin, you're the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. We've heard from our Pentagon correspondent. We've heard from the Secretary of State. This is not the normal kind of military operation that the United States is used to. What can you tell us about the next specific military steps that might be necessary?
Those are being looked at. The options are all being considered, but if I knew which options were going to be used, I would not share them with you here. I don't think we yet know what will be the most effective options. What we do know are a couple things. One is that it must succeed. So it's got to be carefully planned and executed. We can't just strike back in a way which is ineffective. Secondly, it's very clear to me that if we have a broad alliance with us, we will be much more effective. If we have some Muslim nations with us, it'll be far more effective, because if we don't have Muslim nations with us when we strike back, and we will, then bin Laden and his types will be able to say, aha, it's us against them. If Muslim nations join with us, it will not play into bin Laden's hands as it otherwise might. That is our long-range goal, is to go after terrorists, not play in their hands, and that means it's the world versus terrorism, not the West versus Islam.
Senator Kerry, you're, of course, well known as a Vietnam veteran. When the United States got involved in the early 60s in Vietnam, it looked a lot different, of course, than when the U.S. left in the 70s. Are you at all concerned that what the U.S. is getting itself involved in right now could turn out to be another Vietnam?
No. I mean, it just isn't. There isn't even any comparison. I mean, the country is united, galvanized, I think is the word, because we have been attacked in the most clear and dastardly way. I mean, every American understands the nature of this threat, and not every American clearly understood the nature of our presence in Vietnam. And I think that the key here, and I think the President understands it, and I think each of the comments you've heard from my colleagues, and particularly the comments you heard from Secretary Rumsfeld today, I thought they were good comments, and very important ones, and from Secretary Powell. No one is articulating this as a quick event. No one is suggesting that this is going to be war as we've known it in the past. This is different, and Americans need to recognize that. We all need to recognize that. There's a lot of thinking to do. There's a huge amount of adjusting to do. There's a great deal that we need to do on the diplomatic front, and part of this war will be exactly that, a different kind of diplomacy. Much of it will be a very different kind of intelligence effort, both the intelligence gathering and the level to which we undertake it, as well as those things that the intelligence community may engage in. We're going to have to change those rules. In addition to that, we clearly will have some kinds of military events. I am convinced, all of us, we will need to. But we've got to remember who the target is here. We don't want to create, I think it was Carl Levin who just mentioned this. I mean, we cannot allow this to become Islam versus the rest of the world, or the rest of the world versus Islam. Islam is a peaceful religion. The Taliban itself is led by people who are not particularly steeped in religion or schooled in religion. They're not religious leaders as we've known them within the Islamic world. And I think that we have to recognize that Islam itself needs to be part of defining its own peaceful existence and desires, and recognize the threat to all of the world through this kind of terrorist activity.
Let me bring in Senator Warner, who used to be the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Now you're the ranking Republican, the ranking member. Your home state, your state of Virginia, took a direct hit at the Pentagon. Did you ever in your life think that something like this could happen at the Pentagon and at the World Trade Center?
No, Wolf. I spent 5 years there during Vietnam as Undersecretary, Secretary of the Navy. And while fiction wrote these things up, none of us ever thought it could happen. But the one thing here, it did happen, and it may have happened at a point in time when we can now go to war, as the President said, against terrorists and prevent them from getting weapons which, it's hard to believe, cause greater destruction to the United States, whether they're chemical, biological, or the missile attacks, which concern me. But let me just point out.
Well, let me just interrupt for 1 second, Senator Warner.
Well, we ought to start every one of these discussions with expressing our prayers and our hearts for the victims, particularly on this day, Sunday. Every night I go to bed, every morning I get up. They're foremost in my mind. Now, your question.
And I agree completely with you, but the question is this. Why did it take this kind of a disaster to mobilize the U.S. government, the American people, if you will, to get engaged in this war on terrorism?
When Carl and I have been in our committee now 23 years, when I was chairman, I set up a special subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee called Emerging Threats. And for the 2.5 years I was chairman, we were working very hard to try and to look into the future, to put our dollars and assets where they're best needed to combat just the type of thing that we saw happen. Other parts of the Congress were working, but not with the commitment that we have today. We're unified behind our great president. And I want to say to the American people, part of that support has to be the exercise of patience and understanding. We cannot answer every question. Some of us may have answers to it, but it's not in our security interest to say it. The people understandably want direct action, be it military or otherwise. It is wise, and when I was with the President just 2 days ago, he was calm, confident, well-informed, and he will act at such time as he and his advisors are absolutely certain that's the time to act. So we've got to exercise patience and support, and part of that is understanding that all of us here in Washington are working together as a team, unified in the Congress.
Let me bring your chairman back for a second and ask you the same question. Why did it have to take this kind of devastation? We've been hearing about terrorist threats for God knows how long. Why did it take this to mobilize the government?
Because here the attack was brought to not just to Americans, but to Americans in a huge way on our homeland. This is different in the scope of the attack. But by the way, I think many of us have been fighting very hard to move dollars into the fight against terrorism and away from some of the lesser threats. And that's really what should have been done, looking back. And I pray and believe will be done now is that the most likely threats are the terrorist threats. We've been saying that number of years, including some of the folks in both houses of Congress. And I think that now that has been proven clearly the correct path, and that's where we're heading.
All right, Senator Lugar, you want to weigh in on this?
I would just say that until this point, a large number of the American public we're not as interested in foreign policy and defense policy. As a matter of fact, the debate we're about to have on the defense appropriation bill was in question as to whether there would be support for even the fairly modest desires the president had. Now that debate changed because the public changed its mind, and we are fortified by that public resolve.
Senator Graham, you must feel, I was going to say, Senator Graham, you must feel totally frustrated as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee that it took this to get the kind of action that apparently is going to happen right now.
Well, let's put this incident, however, in some context. There have been many previous terrorist initiatives in the United States which have been understood and collapsed before they could be a threat. We had one just a few months ago when a person tried to come across the Canadian border in the state of Washington, clearly with a terrorist intent. This event of Tuesday, this terrible tragedy, is clearly a failure, and it cannot be described otherwise. It needs to be a failure which is an alarm signal that we need to heighten our efforts. The Senate Intelligence Committee will be introducing legislation this week to try to create a better command structure for terrorism response in the United States. We also have already recommended substantial increases in dollars for spies, for better technology, for eavesdropping, for better ability to analyze the tremendous volume of information we collect. We think those will be seen to be weaknesses in our intelligence system that contributed to Tuesday's tragedy. We don't want any of those weaknesses to continue a day longer.
What weakness, Senator Kerry, what weakness do you believe that this failure last Tuesday in the intelligence community, failure to get any advance warning that meant anything, failure in the security community, that these planes were hijacked simultaneously, almost, including 2 planes in Boston, the capital of your state. Tell us what immediate fix can be put forward to reassure the American public.
Well, first of all, I'm supportive, and I will be advocating it this week. We actually have a hearing on it. The takeover of our airline security by the federal government for a lot of different reasons. I spent some time in law enforcement. I know the value of getting state police talking to the local police, talking to the federal authorities, exchanging warrant information, movements between states. We never used to do that. Now we do it fairly well. But here, when you come into the country with your passport is checked, people can tell where you've traveled, where you've been, whether you're on a watch list, and so forth. We have none of that capacity in our airlines today. Unless you fly El Al and you're going to Israel, you don't go through a very lengthy interview, and it's been rather porous, and most Americans know it. And it was porous because, frankly, the business community and a lot of other people wanted it that way. They just wanted to be able to move quickly and easily. Now we know we can't. So I think if you had a coordinated effort whereby there was a sharing of information and a greater scrutiny with respect to who's boarding an aircraft, that's one piece of it. The second piece is you can guarantee that never again will an aircraft be used as a weapon. And the way you do it is by making it clear to every terrorist who's a prospective terrorist that they may get into an airplane, but they will never succeed in being able to pass into the pilot's cockpit because those doors are sealed for all purposes. So while they may kill a flight attendant or they may kill the whole airplane and themselves, they will not be able to fly it into a target. These are things that we can guarantee. But let me come back to a point. Again, I think it was made earlier. Bob Graham said it. Let's not get hung up on the notion that what happened on Tuesday is going to be the preferred avenue of attack in whatever may happen down the road. I assure you it will not be. Probably no American will be safer flying in these next few days ever in history than they will be now. And the terrorists know that. So the next target will be something different, whether it's cyberspace, whether it's our water supplies or food or some other, a bridge, a tunnel. And this is why it is so imperative that we not recognize the solution to this is to give up our freedom. The solution to this is to secure our freedom by destroying the willpower and capacity of these terrorists to do this. And that is a longer, far more painstaking, but much more important mission for all of us now. And we need to focus on the cells and on the efforts in other countries.
Let's